To this day, Bennett is one of the most relevant, powerful and useful characters in the game. And I think that to some degree, he will always be. But the fact that he's such an old and popular character means that we know everything there is to know about him, right? High base attack sword, energy recharge, and that's it. Well, in part that's true, but not totally. There are details that are still worth talking about, and there are also new synergies that sparkled out of new character releases. So in this video, I will try to really dissect Bennett's kit. And while we do, even if you're a veteran player, I think you will find some tech you didn't know about. Let's start with the core and honestly main selling point, his burst. This circle does many things. It applies Pyro to you, which is also an indication that his buff is up. A huge attack bonus that depends on Bennett's base attack, which means his weapon plus his levels. Here's how much attack is giving you with every single sword in the game as of 5.8. Pause if you need, but we're coming back to this later. The burst is also your heal, but remember that before C1 the attack buff is applied only if he's not healing, which happens above 70% HP. Now, his buff, the icon and the element being applied to your character refresh every second, but each application lasts for 2.1 seconds instead. Which first off means that the burst will last a bit after the circle disappears, but it also means that for a brief time, characters going off-field or outside the circle will still have the buff, and characters entering his field might have to wait for it to refresh. This is important for some old characters that snapshot their talents. You don't want to cast something like facial skills right after switching. You want to wait for the Pyro icon to be there to make sure odds keeps Bennett's buff for his entire duration. But the snapshotting era is over. Characters releasing nowadays always use their current stats to determine their damage. However, the lack of this mechanic doesn't stop them from being misplayed, or rather have a chance to be played better. Bennett's buff refreshing is coordinated with the cooldown of the burst. At every full second, it is refreshed. Hardly this comes into play, but know that if you swap off Bennett right at X.0 cooldown, the character coming in will have to wait a full second to get the buff. If instead you swap right before, you will get it much faster, if not instantly. This can be important for Navia, which should never just mindlessly switch and press her skill. And it can also be a problem for someone like Arlecchino, if switching in after having already claimed their bond of life. Generally, however, it doesn't represent an issue for any burst user, even Shanling since she snapshots closer to the end of her animation. And this buff has one last use. Have you ever noticed that sometimes you swap to Bennett and his skill has a much higher cooldown than it should? It's not just the damage dealers that can lose value for not waiting for his buff. That can happen to Bennett himself, as the burst effect also activates his Ascension 4, which decreases the cooldown of his skill by 50%. This is relevant in two scenarios. When you just need to battery your team and the burst is already down, or when you need to apply as much Pyro as possible. One cool thing about Bennett is that he applies Pyro very easily, and he also applies a lot of it. Precisely, he applies 2 units of Pyro per skill press or burst cast, and 1 unit with anything else, C6 included. These units represent how much of the element is actually there. Generally, things in the game apply 1 unit, sometimes 2, and very rarely a different amount. As you can see in the clip, 1 unit of Hydro from Barbara can tank 2 vaporizes out of his Pyro-infused normal attacks, but it will disappear instantly when his skill is used instead. How many of these units of Pyro you apply is important for many setups, but it's also important for how much damage you're going to do to certain enemies. For example, this local legend, soon to be in Stygian, has 16 units of Electro that you need to remove. Each Pyro application is 1 unit removed unless they apply strong Pyro. Bennett's skill will actually remove 2 units instead of 1. Now, you might not want to use Bennett here, but this obviously applies to any shield Pyro can work with. And it also works on enemies that record your elemental application. The Lava Dragon statue is another example. Lastly, I want to point out that the Pyro element applied to you can and will trigger reactions for your enemies, which can make Bennett a pretty high risk, high reward character. But just because we are using this icon as an indication, remember that it's just that, an indication. All his mechanics and buffs are still at work even if your character doesn't have this Pyro icon. For example, when you are in water or the enemy simply applies too much of the other elements. Let's talk about C6 now. I'm not even going to entertain the should I C6 my Bennett question. I think you should, but it's your account, so it's up to you. What I care to talk about is what techs we can get out of it. So first off, let's talk about one of the strongest supportive sets in the game, Cinder City. This set doesn't seem to have much going on for Bennett, but it can actually be very important. I've talked about this in a couple of videos, but Jansen is the character that is able to utilize Bennett C6 to trigger a Pyro Cinder City buff even against enemies that simply don't allow it. This works on the Topo, for example, by applying Electro with her skill and charge attack, or even with the burst and then doing a simple Pyro infused normal attack. When Pyro meets Electro charged, or nowadays Lunar charged, they don't act as a single aura, but simply as both elements on the enemy, which means we are triggering Overload and Vaporize. Overload is an Electro-related reaction and activates the set. Jansen in one small set of actions gives us the full effect of Cinder City for Electro, Hydro and Pyro. Notice how Hoyo carefully made the entire Nathlon roster not great at using this Bennett perk, except for Jansen. But if we go back in time, we can find more such synergies. In Genshin, when a character goes from not applying elements to doing so, it's either because of an elemental conversion or an elemental infusion. These two are different. A conversion is a set of attacks that deal elemental damage, but they cannot be overridden by another element. Think Itto, Alitem, Shilonen. An infusion is instead what Bennett is giving us. And the way it works is kinda weird. An infusion is constantly applying the element to our weapon. This is what is giving you the elemental damage. But what happens if we infuse two different elements? We can actually trigger a reaction on the weapon itself. Now, there is a lot that goes into this, but it's honestly kind of nerdy and unnecessary. The real usage here is for Lynette and Kazuha C6. They can, by just virtue of getting an anime infusion and a Pyro one, trigger swirls on their weapon and not only activate PvE, even against enemies with a permanent elemental aura, but they also get the swirl damage out of it. This is basically the concept of Sunfire. Jin applying Anemo to you, while Bennett applies Pyro, triggering constant Pyro swirls. The only difference here is that we're doing all of that on our weapon, not on our characters. This tech is a bit outdated, I know, but we should always keep an eye out for them. The moment Hoyo releases a weapon or artifact effect that wants us to trigger a reaction to get X or Y, that's when we might be able to turn back at this and find new synergies. Just like in a way we did for Jansen, which was the only chance for many players to try hard and clear Dire in the first region. And before I forget, remember that the text of Bennett C6 is simply wrong. Everyone gets the 15% Pyro damage buff. It's just the infusion obviously limited to melee weapons. You probably knew about this. And lastly, you can obviously use the C6 infusion to, well, upgrade some characters. Unfortunately, a few very old kits, especially for Claymore characters, are not really up to today's standards and low-key get overshadowed by just playing the same character but as a Pyro plunge damage dealer, or similar things. Okay, now instead, let's talk about builds. I have been playing this game since launch, and believe it or not, I'm still looking to improve my Bennett from time to time. The first Stygian rotation got me into strongboxing Noblesse pieces for my Bennett, because I just needed my first burst to come out as soon as possible. And before we talk about stats, I want to point out that the highest base attack swords in the game do not actually offer much to Bennett. And between that and the first option with energy recharge, Skyward Blade, we're losing around 90 flat attack to our main carry, but gaining 55 energy recharge for it. That attack loss on a high base attack character is around 2 attack percentage substats, which honestly is quite a bit, but again, actually bursting on time can be better. But the same cannot be said for going much lower for the sake of energy recharge. Sapwood Blade is obviously its best totally free option, but when seeking high energy recharge, Sacrificial, Pipe and even Favonius sound good, but come at a very high cost in terms of attack your carry is missing. So while appealing, especially Favonius in Stygian, I would avoid it. Buffing weapons are also a possibility, but are pretty situational. The last node on weapons I have is for Aquila Favonia. This weapon has a healing passive and it can also trigger during burst invulnerability, even if you're not taking damage. And of course, this healing is influenced by healing bonus and can help build fun first stacks for Furina. Generally, I run Misplater unless there is Furina, then Aquila becomes my go-to. And since I made this big chart, we can also look at something else. C1 is his best constellation at not only making sure you always have the buff, but it's also a big chunk of extra conversion for your attack. Crowning his burst is instead between 40 to 60 extra attack, which you can picture as 1 extra attack percentage substat for your carry. I'm using this metric of substats to give you a general idea of the values, but of course it will depend on the character. Just to make sure we are on the same page, Bennett is giving us flat attack, and it's good because it's a ton of it. And lastly, if I were to change Bennett's level from 90 to 80 in this spreadsheet, these are the new numbers we would get. In the worst case scenario of a C5 Bennett with a crown and his highest base attack weapon, we are merely losing 20-ish attack. So honestly, if you are on a budget, it's totally fine to leave him at level 80 out of 90, and a crown is more valuable. As far as sets, it's mainly Noblesse, but Instructor, Archaic Petra and Cinder City can sometimes be valuable. And for your stats, you're doing either of these three. 1. You build enough energy recharge and then go offensive with Pyro damage and crit. His healing is great regardless, so might as well squeeze in some damage. 2. You're playing with Furina or just want as much healing as possible. So you still build energy recharge but then go for a HP goblet and healing bonus circlet. Or 3. You just need every single source of energy recharge as humanly possible, so you top left the pieces with the most DR, no matter what stats they have. And we're done! Crazy how we made an entire Bennett video without talking about DPS Bennett. And I had a very cool idea to play that. I showcased it in this video, go check it out. Thank you for watching, let me know what kind of video you would like to see next, and see you in the next one.